Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Καλημέρα σας σε όλους και όλους. Είναι μεγάλη τιμή για το Καναδικό Ινστιτούτο να έχουμε την πρόσκληση να είμαστε εδώ στην ημερίδα. Εκπρόσωπος του Ινστιτούτου και των μέλων μας θα ήθελα να πω είμαστε εδώ όχι μόνο για Έλληνες, αλλά και πριν, ως θα δείτε. Συγγνώμη για ότι θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά, αλλά δυστυχώς όταν διαβάζω ένα τεχνικό κείμενο δεν πάει καλά. Λοιπόν, since the later 19th century, there has been an abiding interest in the Greco-Roman world by Canadian classicists. The fact that the majority of the attention given by these academics was on topics related to ancient Athens was not unusual for the period. However, starting in the 1960s and 1970s, a small but active group of Canadian philologists and classical archaeologists turned their research efforts north to ancient Boeotia. In the forefront of this research was Paul Roche, Albert Schechter, John Fossey at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Robert Buck at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, Dwayne Roller at Wilfrid Laurier University in Kitchener, Ontario, and Richard Hope Simpson at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Their studies focused mainly on the historical and the epigraphical evidence for constructing the history, political institutions, religious cults, and prosopography of the Kinon of the Boeotians, and especially Thebes and Thespi in the 4th century BC. An important component of these investigations was topographical studies within the region. This interest in identifying the location of historic settlements, sanctuaries, and battlefields mentioned in the various ancient sources gradually evolved into documenting in a non-systematic fashion the existence of pre-Hellenic sites as well. These efforts, research efforts started in the early 1970s to produce a significant number of publications, a trend that continues to the present. The journal Tiresias and the monograph series Viotia Antiqua, both published by McGill University, form the foundation for the dissemination of the results. Albert Schachter's 4-volume Cults of Boeotia and Robert Buck's A History of Boeotia are landmark publications. John Fossey's numerous topographical studies and Richard Hope Simpson's Gazetteer of Bronze Age Sites brought the ancient Boeotian landscape into focus. In 1976, the then Canadian Archaeological Institute in Athens was recognized formally as one of the foreign archaeological schools and institutes by the Hellenic Ministry of Culture. As the Boeotian specialists were among the core founders of the Institute, it should not come as a surprise that the first archaeological fieldwork permit given to the Institute in 1980 was for the investigation of ancient Corsaia, the near-modern prodromos in southeastern Boeotia, by a team led by Professor John Fossey. Their investigative strategy consisted of 3 integrated components: an intensive survey of selected areas of the Hora of the polis, a systematic survey of the Acropolis, the Castron, and its surrounding slopes, and the excavation of a series of trenches to date various architectural features and to define their functions. Such a holistic approach was unusual for the period. The site's general arrangement consists of an acropolis at its core, with the western and eastern quarters falling on either side of this acropolis. To the south of the eastern quarter is the southern corner, where 2 towers of the city wall are present. Further to the south lies an area which has been identified as an industrial sector. Kostia appears to have been occupied discontinuously from the Middle Neolithic period onward, with good evidence for the Bronze Age. In the early Iron Age, occupation is represented only by scattered surface material and sherds in a few deposits. The only structural remains from the prehistoric period are several terrace walls in a Cyclopean style and a variety of later polygonal styles. In the later classical period, activity at this site becomes much more intense. Extensive fortifications are built around the Acropolis and the lower city in ashlar style, which shows a considerable degree of sophistication. They appear to have been in use until the Hellenistic period, when the site was destroyed and abandoned. The causes of this abandonment are unclear, although the appearance of Romans are probably to be given responsibility. It is known that the Romans dealt sternly with the immediate neighbor city of Thisbe around 170 BCE, and Kostia may have suffered the same fate. Whatever the cause of the destruction, the site was unoccupied for several centuries, until the late Roman period. In the 5th century CE, the walls were reinforced in a poor mortared style, and many buildings were erected in the interior, using blocks lying around from the earlier destruction of the city walls. The final end of occupation came within the late Roman period, with another destruction and accompanied by widespread fire. During both the Hellenistic and the Roman occupation, there is evidence that olive cultivation and sheep rearing for wool was important. The Institute's third fieldwork permit in 1985 was for a topographical and architectural study of ancient Tanagra near modern Grimada in southeastern Boeotia. The team, led by Professor Roller, mapped the visible remains of this little investigated polis center. In doing so, they established the course of the perimeter wall, the orthogonal plan of the city, and located the remains of many substantial buildings, including a theater. No artifacts were collected during this survey. After a hiatus of over 20 years, a Canadian project returned to conduct archaeological fieldwork in Boeotia. The Eastern Boeotia Archaeological Project, or EBAP, was created by Professors Brendan Burke, Brian Burns, and Susan Lupak in collaboration with Dr. Vasilios Arvantinos, the then director of the 9th EPA, Eforεία of Prehistoric and Classical Antiquities. The primary aim was to investigate the potential model of secondary centers in Boeotia outside of palatial Thebes in the Mycenaean period. The team conducted a systematic and intensive survey between 2007 and 2009 in a 10 by 16 hectare portion of the plain east of Thebes. This research zone was designed to include sites where palatial activity was already documented by earlier work. Chief among these were Bronze Age Tanagra, where the famous painted larnacas were recovered in excavations of chamber tombs, cemeteries at Gethera and Dendron. A particular interest was ancient Elion, adjacent to the village of Arma, which was well known because of its significant stretch of curving fortification wall and other surface remains. The survey pottery identified in the initial survey at ancient Elion pointed to a long span of Bronze Age activity from early Helladic to late Helladic 3C. This included pottery styles associated with the transition from the Middle Helladic to the late Helladic I periods. Further, during the late Helladic 3B2 period, Elion held a significant place in the regional hierarchy, as indicated by references on 2 linear B tablets excavated here in Thebes. Both tablets are associated with the destruction of the administrative center and offer a centralized perspective on the economic hierarchy operating in the later 13th century in this Mycenaean kingdom. Starting in 2011 and continuing until the present, EBAP has conducted excavations at Elion to elucidate the settlement's position over time in the regional settlement system. This research is a synergasia with Dr. Alexandra Χαραμή, the director of the Eforeit of Antiquities of Boeotia. After 7 years of systematic digging, they have uncovered many significant remains as well as dated the construction of the visible wall. In brief, their work identified 4 major periods of occupation at the site of ancient Elion, which is located on this elevated plateau overlooking the Theban plain en route to Chalkis and the Euboean Gulf. First phase was a prehistoric one, which spans from the end of the early Bronze Age to the beginning of the Mycenaean palatial period. That is approximately 2000 to 1600 BCE. In the second phase, toward the end of the Mycenaean age, there was a substantial levels dating to the late Helladic 3B and late Helladic 3C subphases. That is approximately 1300 to 1100 BCE. The site seems to have been abandoned by the early Iron Age. The third phase is the post-Bronze Age. The earliest recovered material is late geometric Euboean pottery of the 8th century. Elion itself, however, seemed not to have been reoccupied in a substantial way until the mid-6th century BC. Also dating to the late Archaic period is the construction of the large polygonal wall. After the 5th century BCE, there is a long period of inactivity again. The latest archaeological phase in evidence is the medieval period, from materials surviving in the surface and in deep pits, seems to date mostly to the 15th and 16th centuries CE. This would indicate most likely that the stone tower that remains, whose remains mark the western end of the site, must date to this period. Since a Middle Helladic cyst tomb was excavated in the Northwestern Cemetery, it was not surprising to find 2 similar cyst tombs in the southwestern sector. These last two were opened and emptied long ago. Below the Middle Bronze Age levels, there is evidence for occupation at the end of the early Bronze Age. The defining feature on the eastern side of the excavation is a large funerary complex labeled the Blue Stone Structure, so named because of the polished blue limestone blocks used to cap a large rectangular perimeter wall. This structure was covered with a mound of clay to mark an early Mycenaean cemetery of some significance, dating to the formative period of Mycenaean society, that is, the 17th century. The structure is oriented north-south with a length of approximately 17 meters, making it one of the largest constructions from Central Greece of the shaft grave period, that is, late Middle Helladic to early late Helladic I periods. The earthen fill that made up the tumulus was stabilized by poorly constructed parallel spine walls. Scattered about were remnants of a series of cobbled surfaces. In this matrix, two massive undecorated grave stelae were found in situ. One stele was above the middle point of a large tomb labeled number 5. A second similar size stele did not stand above a singular tomb, but seems to have been built in parallel to the first and reinforce the burial nature of this area. Upon excavation, both stelae are quite prominent, and this likely explains why they were concealed within the poorly made spine walls. They marked the cemetery. The builders of these tombs commemorated their dead, but also wanted to ensure the integrity of the burial complex by encasing it in a tumulus. Within the fill of the tumulus were a series of large flat capstones. Most of the individual cistombs were indicated by these capping stones. Each capstone rested on a ring of smaller stones which formed a bedding, which in turn sat upon large rocks, which often placed vertically, creating the sidewalls of the tomb. As all of the human remains associated with the bluestone structure, both within and without, demonstrate that there was a population of early Mycenaeans at Elion who separated physically selected burials from a large cemetery that likely began in the Middle Helladic period. Although the grave goods from the tombs within the structure may not at first seem to indicate overly high status, the totality of the finds, including a bronze dagger, an ivory pommel, and well-made vessels, and the elaborate tomb construction suggests a group of high-status individuals whose burials were demarcated and commemorated. Ceramic evidence indicates construction of the tumulus in the late Helladic I period, which is generally consistent with the ceramic evidence inside the tumulus. This was the formative period of Mycenaean culture. At other sites, there is evidence, too, of elites working to establish themselves in a mortuary landscape and attempting to distinguish themselves from their forebears and their contemporaries through distinctive burial architecture. The next visible phase of occupation on the plateau comes in the 13th and 12th centuries BCE in the form of what were large domestic structures. Only small portions of these buildings have been revealed to date. The occupation spans from the late Helladic 3B2 to the late Helladic 3C middle periods in archaeological terms. The plateau seems to have been abandoned at the end of the 12th century BCE. After a passage of centuries, the earliest recoverable material is late geometric Euboean pottery of the 8th century BCE. Some of the earliest known types of Boeotian bird bowls dating to the 7th century BCE have been found as well. In the 6th century, Attic black figure pottery appears. Nevertheless, Elion seems not to have been reoccupied in a substantial fashion until the mid-6th century BCE, based on the date of the earliest miniature vessels and terracotta figurines, which were found in abundance. Also dating to the late Archaic period is the construction of the large polygonal wall, which is the most important, most impressive monument at the site. The construction of the wall and the two bastions and the associated ramp and the large gate seem to have been done circa 500 BCE in one well thought out building program beginning in the south and working to the north. Visible today is 84 meters of that wall, which follows an arc of a circle which has a radius of 41 meters. The wall sits on stable soil, occasionally resting on bedrock with rubble fill. Probably the complete wall was 3.3 meters in height, forming from a leveling course to the coping stone. The source of the stone used in the wall construction was local. Associated with the construction of the wall was a ramped entranceway. This reused the remains of the existing Mycenaean fortification architecture. It consisted of a multi-phase curved ramp with crushed limestone pebbles, which created a white plaster surface. This led to an impressive threshold block, which spanned almost the entirety of a corridor produced by two parallel Mycenaean walls. Two abundant deposits of votive material consisting of miniature vessels and terracotta figurines found in the two areas indicates frequent activity throughout the beginning of the classical period. After the 4th century BCE, there was little evidence of occupation. Post-classical material survives only in surface levels and deep pits. These finds date consistently to the 15th and 16th centuries CE, which could indicate a relatively late date for the stone tower, whose remains are at the top of the slide. Over the past 50 years, Canadian research activities relating to the antiquities of Boeotia have expanded and matured. Humanistic approaches of the 1960s and the 1970s emphasized Boeotian political geography, civil institutions, cults, leaders and generals, and military history. In the past decade, Canadians have pursued multidisciplinary archaeological investigations aimed at documenting regional political and economic networks, illuminating domestic assemblages and lifeways, as well as mortuary practices. With the continuing excavation at ancient Elion, the Institute's project there is educating the next generation of Canadian archaeologists seeking to explore the distinctive and rich Boeotian path. This long collaborative relationship will continue to produce important insights into the cultural heritage of Boeotia. Thank you. Ευχαριστώ.